The paper James slid across the table had 3 lines. Say where you're going. Say when you'll be back. Send one message when you arrive. His father stared at it like it weighed more than paper should. Yesterday, he'd taken knee without telling anyone. The whole family spent hours thinking she was gone. Now James tapped the page.
Nobody forgets.
Simple.
Nobody guesses.
Nobody forgets. Nobody guesses.
Okay.
If you've had to create rules to keep fear from breaking your family, you know structure feels like love. Like and subscribe so families healing together find these stories. Hello and welcome back. Sometimes the hardest conversations aren't about what someone did wrong. They're about building something strong enough that it won't happen again. Morning didn't arrive like a new day. It arrived like a sigh. The house was quiet in that soft, post-storm way. When the fear has already burned through your body, and all that's left is exhaustion and gratitude. Nye was asleep on the couch with her stuffed orange tucked under her chin, cheeks pink from yesterday's play. One of her little coloring toys sat on the floor beside her like proof that yesterday wasn't a nightmare, just a misunderstanding that got too big. James stood at the kitchen counter with a glass of water he hadn't touched. His eyes kept flicking toward Nye like he needed to see her breathing to believe she was still there. Diep sat across from him, hands folded tight, not angry anymore, just drained. The kind of tired that comes from spending hours imagining the worst. James's mother moved quietly around the kitchen, wiping a counter that was already clean, because some people clean when they don't know what else to do with their feelings. Because the house was so quiet, everyone heard it when James's father finally came out of the back room. He didn't come out loud. He came out like a man who realized he had scared the entire house without meaning to. He looked at Nye first, still sleeping peacefully. Then he looked at James, then at Diep. I took her out, he said, voice controlled but strained. I didn't think it would become that. James didn't explode. That was the surprise. Diep had braced for yelling, for accusation, for all the anger James had every right to feel. But James inhaled slowly, like he was choosing what kind of man he wanted to be in this moment. She had fun, James said quietly. That's not the problem. James's father nodded once, already understanding where this was going. What the problem, James continued, voice steady, is that nobody knew where she was. Diep's voice came out smaller than usual. My whole body, she started, then stopped. She swallowed hard against the memory. I thought I lost her. Those 4 words hung in the air like something breakable. James's father's jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands like they didn't feel like his hands anymore. I was wrong, he said finally. I thought I was doing something good. I didn't think you'd panic. James's mother's voice cut through, not cruel, but honest. You didn't think, she said simply. Silence settled over the kitchen, thick and uncomfortable. Then James walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down like a CEO about to run a meeting. Because that's what he does when emotions try to derail everything. He turns feeling into structure. Okay, he said. We don't do blame spirals, we do procedures. Diep let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half relief, because that was so perfectly James. When fear tries to ruin a family, he builds a system that protects them. Because James had chosen structure over anger, the tension in the room shifted slightly. His father pulled out a chair and sat down too, waiting. James looked at him directly. "Dad," he said, calm and clear, "I want you in this family, but you don't get to freelance with our child." His father flinched at the word freelance, and Diep saw it land, sharper than any yelling could have been. It was the perfect word. Clinical, professional. It said, "You treated my daughter like a side project." James's father swallowed. Understood. James's mother leaned forward, hands folded on the table. "Say it again," she told him, gently but firm, "so everyone can breathe." James's father met her eyes, then James's, then Diep's. "I don't take her anywhere without telling you," he said clearly. "Not to the store, not to the park, nowhere." Diep's shoulders dropped a fraction. That was the sentence she'd needed to hear. James nodded once. "Good." Then he reached for a piece of paper and a pen from the counter behind him. He wrote quickly, deliberately, then slid the paper to the center of the table. It wasn't dramatic. It was a simple list in his neat handwriting. The 3-step rule. Say where you're going. Say when you'll be back. Send one message when you arrive. He tapped the page with one finger. "That's it," he said. Simple. Nobody forgets. Nobody guesses. James's father stared at the paper like it was heavier than it looked. His finger reached out slowly and touched the edge of it, almost reverent. "Fine," he said, voice rough. "I'll do it." Because the rule was now written and accepted, Diep felt brave enough to add one more thing. "And if plans change," she said quietly but firmly, "you tell us. Not later, not after dinner. Right away." James's father's eyes met hers, and for the first time since he'd walked out of that back room, his face showed something close to shame. "Right away," he repeated. On the couch, Nye shifted and mumbled something in her sleep. Something about toys and watercoloring and Papa's car. James's mother smiled despite everything. "She had a good day," she whispered. Diep looked at her daughter, eyes burning. "I'm glad she did," she said. "I just can't survive another day like yesterday." James stood, walked over to Nye, and adjusted the blanket so it covered her small shoulders properly. Then he turned back to the adults, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a second rule being made. "We stop saying the worst words in front of each other," he said. "No kidnapped. I know gone forever. We keep our heads." Diep nodded immediately, ashamed of how far her fear had run, how she'd said terrible things in panic, things that had made James's mother cry, things that couldn't be unsaid. James's father looked away. "I heard you," he said quietly. "I heard you talking like I'd..." He stopped, unable to finish. James's mother's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. So fear makes people say terrible things, she murmured. That's why we need rules. That paper on the table, the 3-step rule, sat between them like a small treaty. James picked it up, walked to the refrigerator, and placed it under a magnet. The words faced out, visible to anyone who entered the kitchen. This stays here, he said. Everyone follows it, no exceptions. His father stared at the paper on the fridge like it was a test he'd already agreed to take. That afternoon, they did the most healing thing they could do. They went back to normal. Diep went to the garden and watered like her hands needed to remember control. Basil trimmed, soil turned, lime sapling checked. The familiar routine steadied her breathing. James took a short call from work and told them he'd be in later, because family came first today. And for once, nobody questioned that decision. James's father, after watching the paper on the fridge for a long moment, sat on the floor when Nee woke up. He didn't try to buy forgiveness with gifts or explanations. He just played. He brought out the same little toys from yesterday and asked, softer this time, "Which one do you like?" Nee's eyes lit up. Yesterday's adventure already filed away as fun, not trauma. "This one," she declared, then pointed at another. "And this one." James watched from the doorway, face unreadable. Diep stepped beside him, voice low. "You okay?" James nodded slowly. "I'm watching," he said. "Not hunting, just watching." And that was growth, the ability to supervise without suffocating, to protect without punishing. Nahai's laughter rang out as James's father made one of the toys walk across the floor. The sound was so normal, so bright, that it almost hurt. Diep felt her throat tighten. She forgave him already, she whispered. "Kids forgive fast," James said. "It's us who need the rules to move forward." At dinner that evening, something surprising happened. James's father cleared his throat and looked directly at Diep. "I'm sorry," he said. No speeches, no excuses, just those 2 words, heavy with meaning. Diep paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully and met his eyes. The apology wasn't elaborate, but it was real. "Thank you," she said quietly. James's mother set down a bowl of soup like she was placing peace itself on the table. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying hope. "We start fresh." James looked around at all of them. His father, his mother, Diep, and Nai eating like nothing in the world was fragile. And he spoke like a man building a life on purpose, one decision at a time. "Tomorrow," he agreed, "we work, we laugh, we follow the rules, and we don't scare each other again." Nai lifted her spoon and said, like she was making it official, "Yes, no scare." Saitan, everyone laughed. Quiet, tired laughter that came from relief more than joy. But it was real. After dinner, James's father stood and walked to the refrigerator. He stood in front of the 3-step rule for a long moment, reading it again. Then he pulled out his phone and took a photo of it. "So I don't forget," he said simply. James nodded. "Good." James took a short call from work and told them he'd be in later, because family came first today. And for once, nobody questioned that decision. James's father, after watching the paper on the fridge for a long moment, sat on the floor when Nye woke up. He didn't try to buy forgiveness with gifts or explanations. He just played. He brought out the same little toys from yesterday and asked, softer this time, "Which one do you like?" Nye's eyes lit up. Yesterday's adventure already filed away as fun, not trauma. "This one," she declared, then pointed at another. "And this one." James watched from the doorway, face unreadable. Diep stepped beside him, voice low. "You okay?" James nodded slowly. "I'm watching," he said. "Not hunting, just watching." And that was growth, the ability to supervise without suffocating, to protect without punishing. Nye's laughter rang out as James's father made one of the toys walk across the floor. The sound was so normal, so bright, that it almost hurt. Diep felt her throat tighten. "She forgave him already," she whispered. "Kids forgive fast," James said. "It's us who need the rules to move forward." At dinner that evening, something surprising happened. James's father cleared his throat and looked directly at Diep. "I'm sorry," he said. No speeches, no excuses. Just those two words, heavy with meaning. Diep paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully and met his eyes. The apology wasn't elaborate, but it was real. "Thank you," she said quietly. James's mother set down a bowl of soup like she was placing peace itself on the table. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying hope, "we start fresh." James looked around at all of them. His father, his mother, Diep, and knew eating like nothing in the world was fragile. And he spoke like a man building a life on purpose, one decision at a time. "And tomorrow," he agreed, "we work, we laugh, we follow the rules, and we don't scare each other again." Nye lifted her spoon and said, like she was making it official, "Yes, no scare." Everyone laughed. Quiet, tired laughter that came from relief more than joy. But it was real. After dinner, James's father stood and walked to the refrigerator. He stood in front of the 3-step rule for a long moment, reading it again. Then he pulled out his phone and took a photo of it. "So I don't forget," he said simply. James nodded. "Good." The photo of the 3-step rule stayed on James's father's phone. Diep knew because she saw him check it the next morning at breakfast, scrolling to it like he was reviewing instructions. That small action, him looking at his phone, reading his own promise, loosened something in her chest that had been tight since yesterday. Nye sat between her grandparents, eating fruit and chattering about a dream she'd had involving talking animals and a very important meeting. James's father listened with the kind of attention that felt different now, more careful, more aware that this small person was not his to take lightly. James poured tea and slid a cup toward Diep. Their fingers touched briefly, and he squeezed once. A quiet check-in. "You okay?" She nodded, getting there. Because the morning felt steadier, the day unfolded with something close to normal. James went to the shop for a few hours. Diep worked in the garden with Tien helping, which meant pulling random weeds and declaring them bad guys. James's mother swept the porch while James's father sat nearby reading the news on his phone, occasionally glancing up to watch Tien play. Around mid-afternoon, James's father stood and walked to where Diep was kneeling by the basil. He cleared his throat. "I'd like to take Tien to see the ducks at the park," he said, "if that's allowed." Diep's hands stilled in the soil. Her first instinct was to say no, to never let Tien out of her sight again, to wrap fear around her daughter like armor. But then she looked at James's father's face. He wasn't asking casually. He was asking like someone who knew he'd broken trust and was trying to earn it back, one small permission at a time. "When?" Diep asked, voice steadier than she felt. "Now," he said. "For 1 hour, the park is 10 minutes away." Diep stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands. "The 3-step rule," she said. "I know," he replied immediately. He pulled out his phone and showed her the photo of the paper. "I've been looking at it all morning." That honesty, the admission that he needed a reminder, that he wasn't trusting himself to just remember, melted Diep's resistance slightly. "Okay," she said. Then, before fear could change her mind, she added, "But I need all 3 steps." "Exactly." James's father nodded. "Where?" "The duck park on Nguyen Tri." "When back?" 1 hour from now, so 3:15. And I'll send a message when we arrive." Diep's throat tightened. He'd memorized it. "Okay," she whispered. Tien looked up from her bad guy pile. "Duck park?" she asked, eyes brightening. "Oh, with Grandpa," James's father said, then glanced at Diep for confirmation. She nodded, even though her chest was already tightening with the beginning of anxiety. They watched him load Tien into the car, seatbelt checked twice. Nien's stuffed orange tucked beside her, door closed gently. Then he drove away, and Diep stood in the driveway with dirt still on her hands, heart pounding. James's mother appeared beside her. "He'll follow the rule," she said quietly. "I know," Diep said. "But knowing doesn't stop the fear." They went inside together. Diep washed her hands 3 times, then checked her phone even though only 2 minutes had passed. James's mother made tea without asking if Diep wanted any, just set a cup in front of her and sat down. At 2:23, Diep's phone buzzed. A photo. Tien standing by a pond, pointing at ducks. Her mouth open in what was clearly delighted yelling. Below it, a message. Arrived. Duck park. She's teaching the ducks to line up. Diep's laugh came out half sob. She showed James's mother. "He remembered," James's mother said softly, then added even softer, "He's trying." Shy, because the message had come exactly as promised. Diep felt her breathing slow. Not calm exactly, but less like drowning. 20 minutes later, another photo arrived. Tien holding a stick, conducting an invisible orchestra of ducks. Message: all good. Leaving in 20 minutes. Diep set the phone down and realized her hands weren't shaking anymore. At 3:12, the car pulled into the driveway. 3 minutes early, Diep met them outside, and Nai tumbled out talking at full speed about duck names and pond rules and why one duck was definitely the boss. James's father stood by the car, and when Nee ran inside to tell her grandmother about the ducks, he looked at Diep directly. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. Diep nodded, throat tight. Thank you for following the rule." That evening, when James came home from the shop, Diep told him about the park trip. His face stayed carefully neutral as he listened. Protective instinct warring with the desire to let healing happen. "And?" he asked when she finished. "And it was fine," Diep said. "He followed every step." James's jaw loosened slightly. "Good," he said, then quieter. "That's how it's supposed to work." After Nai went to bed that night, James's father knocked softly on their bedroom door. James opened it, and his father stood there holding his phone. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. "Just for a minute." James glanced at Diep. She nodded. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said, giving them space. But she left the door cracked, not to eavesdrop exactly, but because she needed to know this conversation happened. James's father sat on the edge of their bed, phone in his hands. "Well, I didn't understand," he started, voice low. "Yesterday, when I took her, I thought I was being helpful. I thought I was giving you a break." James stayed standing, arms crossed. "Dad." "Let me finish," his father interrupted gently. "I didn't understand because when you were small, nobody told me where you were half the time. I'd come home and you'd be at a neighbor's house or down the street, and nobody thought twice about it." James's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but understanding. "Different time," James said. "Different world," his father agreed. "But that's not an excuse. Yesterday I scared Diep badly, and you, and my wife." He looked down at his phone, at the photo of the 3-step rule. "This paper, it's not just about telling you where Nai is." "No?" James asked. "It's about respecting that she's yours," his father said. "Not mine, yours. And I forgot that." The silence between them held weight, but not the crushing kind, the kind that comes before rebuilding. "I'm learning to be a grandfather," James's father continued. "And apparently I need written instructions." James almost smiled. "Most people do," he said. His father looked up. The rule helps," he said. "It makes it simple. I don't have to guess what you need from me." James sat down beside him on the bed. "That's why I wrote it," he said. "Not to punish you, to make it clear." "It's clear now," his father said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then James said something Diep, listening from the kitchen, would remember forever. "I want Nai to love you," James said quietly. "I want her to have a grandfather who takes her to see ducks and makes her laugh. But I need to know where she is, that's all. Just tell me, and we're good." His father's voice came out rough. "I'll tell you," he said. "Every time." The next morning, the 3-step rule was still on the fridge. But now it had company. A drawing Nee had made, stuck beside it with a magnet. 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled Papa, Grandpa, Me, with a pond full of ducks around them. James's father stood in front of both papers, the rule and the drawing, and touched them both gently. James's mother came up behind him. "She forgave you faster than we did," she observed. "Our kids always do," he said. Then quieter, "But I'll earn it anyway." That afternoon, James's father asked if he could take Knight to the small shop down the street for ice cream. He said where, when, and promised to send a photo on arrival. Diep said yes without her chest tightening. The photo came 3 minutes after they left. Nye pointing at ice cream flavors like she was making the world's most important decision. James looked at his phone, then at Diep. "It's working," he said. "It's working," she agreed. By the end of the week, the 3-step rule had become so normal that James's father didn't need to look at his phone anymore. He just did it, said where, said when, sent the update. And slowly, the fear that had gripped Diep's chest since that terrible afternoon loosened its hold. One evening, James took the original paper off the fridge and held it up. "Think we still need this?" he asked. Diep looked at it. Those 3 simple lines that had saved their family from breaking. "Yes," she said. "It stays. Not because we don't trust him now. Because it works." James nodded and put it back, smoothing it flat against the refrigerator door. Nee walked by, glanced at it and said matter-of-factly, "That's the Don't Scare Mama paper." James's mother laughed. "That's exactly what it is," she said. That night, Diep stood in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. So, the house was quiet. The good kind of quiet. The kind that comes after storms pass and families choose each other again. The 3-step rule glowed softly in the dim light from the stove. Beside it, Nye's drawing of the duck park visit smiled with crayon confidence. Structure and joy, side by side. Diep touched both papers gently, then turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, where James was already asleep and Noe was dreaming peacefully in the next room. The fear wasn't gone completely. It probably never would be. But it had a shape now, and boundaries, and a simple 3-step system that kept it from swallowing them whole. Sometimes the best protection isn't locks and alarms. It's 3 simple sentences on a refrigerator door, followed by everyone who loves each other enough to try.